Previously on The Dark Side of Love, devout Baptist and prominent dentist Colin Howell is having a steamy affair with the Sunday school teacher at his church, a woman by the name of Hazel Buchanan. Colin and Hazel's spouses, Trevor and Lesley, are devastated by the affair, which seems to have no end in sight, until one dark night in May, when the lives of these four spouses change forever. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on part 2 of the case I'm calling Monsters in the Dark. May 18th, 1991. It's nighttime. A drugged Lesley is asleep on the couch. Her and Colin's 4 children are asleep in their rooms, tuckered out after celebrating their son Daniel's 2nd birthday that day, the kids having stayed up 2 hours past their normal 8 p.m. bedtime. Meanwhile, a wide-awake Colin locks his sleeping children in their rooms before he creeps into the living room carrying a hose that just happens to be attached to his car's tailpipe with one of the bottles belonging to his baby. That is attached to a hose pipe, and he stretches that contraption from the garage across the living room and near a sleeping Lesley's face. He ran out of the room and waited, watching, waiting. Lesley woke up, realized something was happening, that she was in danger, called out for her oldest son, Matthew. Colin covered his nose and mouth and ran into the room, took a blanket and threw it over her face, essentially smothering her. According to Colin, Lesley took 2 or 3 breaths, and then she died. Lesley Howell was 31 years old. Colin dressed Lesley in a pair of leggings and a t-shirt, then carried her body to his car in the garage and put her in the trunk. He throws a blanket over her as well as his bicycle on top of her. He checks on his children one last time before he drives off with their dead mother in the trunk of his car. He drives to Charnwood Park, where Hazel lives and where Trevor is sleeping peacefully. Colin pulls into the Buchanan's garage and enters the house, and just like he did with his wife, placed the hose contraption near a sleeping Trevor's face and waited. Like Lesley, Trevor woke up, realized what was happening, and as Colin expected, Trevor fought. The 2 men struggled, and Colin put his hand over Trevor's mouth and eventually forced the hose into his mouth, all while the dying father of 2, devoted husband and police officer, stared straight at him. Colin said Trevor took 3 or 4 breaths before he, too, died. Trevor Buchanan was 32 years old. Like Lesley, Colin dressed Trevor and took him out into the garage, putting his body into the trunk next to his dead wife. Colin then drove the 2 bodies to his recently deceased father-in-law's house in Castle Rock to a row of cottages called the 12 Apostles and pulled into the garage. He took Lesley's body out of the trunk and placed her in the back seat, scattering some family photos around her. There was a picture of Lesley and her late mother, one of Lesley and her brother Chris and their late father, and a photo of Lesley and Colin. None of the 4 children. He then placed headphones from a Walkman around her ears, her favorite gospel music playing through the speakers. Trevor was put into the driver's seat of Colin's car, a Renault Savannah, his right hand on the steering wheel, one leg awkwardly folded beneath him, the other leg partially out of the car, suggesting to someone who didn't know any better that perhaps he'd changed his mind and was trying to escape. Colin took an old vacuum cleaner, hooked it up to the exhaust pipe, and turned the car on, making it look as though Lesley and Colin had died in a fume-filled car due to a suicide pact, not individually in their own homes. Colin then took his bicycle and rode off, arriving home 4 hours later. The next morning, Sunday, May 19th, a little before 9, Colin called Jim Flanagan, one of the elders from Coleraine Baptist Church, where they all attended, and asked for his help in locating Lesley, claiming that she'd taken off the night before in his car, and he thought she might be with Trevor. Jim headed to the house, and while Colin bounced his 6-month-old baby Johnny on his knee, the other children playing nearby, unaware that their father had murdered their mother the night before, Colin innocently handed Jim Leslie's suicide note that he had from the time when Lesley had tried to OD, and wrote a note to Colin afterwards. Colin told Jim he thought Lesley might be at the 12 Apostles' house and asked if he would go over and check it out. Jim complies, but reports back that there was no sign of Lesley or Trevor. Now, this obviously won't do because Colin needs someone else to find Lesley and Trevor. So then he says, "Hey, I'll give you the keys to the house if you'll just check it out one more time." This time around, Jim calls police officer David Green and asks him to accompany him to the house. They arrive at the house around 1:20 in the afternoon, and while Officer Green inspects the house, Jim checks the garage, which is where he found Lesley and Trevor's bodies. Now, given the suicide note from Lesley, her generally well-known distress about the affair that her husband was having with Hazel, and her decline over the past few months, as well as her father's death, it was widely accepted that she would have taken her own life. It was also accepted that Trevor must have been more despondent over his wife's affair with Colin, and that he and Lesley had formed some kind of a trauma bond, and because of that, had decided to embark on a suicide pact and take their lives together. And in fact, the coroner rules that their deaths are due to suicide from carbon monoxide poisoning. An obvious question here is, why wasn't this investigated more closely? Was Colin just that good? Well, it was a combination of that and the environment in Northern Ireland at the time. As Detective Superintendent Raymond Murray, who led the original investigation, noted to the BBC, quote, "I think we've got to remember 1991 was a very different place in Northern Ireland. There were 102 terrorist murders alone, and CID were a lot more stretched than they are at the minute." So while the police had their hands full at the time, I think another factor, frankly, was the stigma around suicide and how the murders reflected on the church and its involvement in the affair, because Colin and Lesley, Hazel and Trevor had received marital counseling from the church, and everything was declared to be A-okay. Everybody can go back to the way they were. But in fact, Colin and Hazel had resumed their affair, and they were hotter and heavier than ever. And Colin had decided that he wanted to be with Hazel. He had to be with Hazel, and that meant getting rid of the obstacles, namely Lesley and Trevor. So Northern Ireland Police, there was a report from the Northern Ireland Police Ombudsman about the case that was released in 2011 and indicated that critical and frankly standard investigative tactics were completely ignored and overlooked in this case. So as an example, there was no forensic evidence gathered. Bruising to Trevor's face where Colin had punched him during when he was trying to get him to take the hose. Those bruises on his face were not recorded. There were no fingerprints taken at the scene, no log of the scene, no measurements, no sketches, nothing. Absolutely standard evidence gathering, just blown off. There was also Trevor's position in the driver's seat. Now, Trevor was taller than Colin, which meant he would not have fit behind the steering wheel without some adjustment. And this was not something Colin thought about. But as a result, as I mentioned before, one of Trevor's legs, it was hanging out of the car door, and the other one was kind of folded beneath him in this weird kind of way. And so what looked like, oh, maybe he changed his mind and was trying to get out, was actually because Colin had not moved the seat back to accommodate Trevor's height, to accommodate the differences in height between the two men. And also, there were inconsistencies from both Hazel and Colin in their stories that were not followed up on. And the fact that Colin kept insisting that someone check the garage at Lesley's father's house. Apparently this happened like 3 different times, and nobody thought that was strange. One of the more junior officers at the scene, who also happened to be a member of the church, did raise suspicions about the scene, but it was poo-pooed by these two senior officers who were also present at the scene. This ombudsman report says flat out, quote, members of Coleraine Baptist Church influenced the 1991 police investigation in an attempt to, quote, downplay the deaths in order to minimize embarrassment caused to the church. The report went on to say, quote, at the time of the deaths, the Buchanan family raised concerns that members of Coleraine Baptist Church were keen to downplay the deaths and conducted low-key funeral services in order to minimize any criticism leveled at the church about how they had dealt with the affair between Colin and Hazel, Howell and Stewart in the report. Shortly after the deaths, the church held a meeting of its congregation at which some members criticized the manner in which the church had dealt with the affair. So you have a highly charged political environment, an overworked police force, the undue influence of a church in a small town, and a pretty diabolical plan, and frankly, that means Colin is getting away with it. And because of this, he comes to believe he'll fly under the police radar, with the BBC reporting, quote from him, I know I lived in a world of believing I could do anything, like a fantasy world, where I could do anything, and so I probably believed I could do it and get away with it. So now his desperation for Hazel can finally be quenched, and Hazel and Colin continue their affair, even though it was still a secret. And in fact, Hazel, devout Christian, like all of the spouses in this, all the players, they were all devout Christians. Hazel is so racked with guilt about all of this. The only way that she will consent to having sex with Colin is when he sedates her with dental surgery drugs. So basically, she has to be unconscious in order to have sex with Colin, and therefore she can't feel guilty about it because she doesn't know what's happening, she can't remember it. So her conscience is clear, which is insane. Absolutely insane. And then he went along with this. Anyway, insane. While Colin didn't murder Lesley for financial gain, the truth is he did get a hefty chunk of change following her death from both an insurance policy that she had and money that she inherited from her father, all told about $500,000. The money allowed Colin to save his struggling dental practice and make it profitable, where he was eventually able to charge up to £10,000 for cosmetic dental procedures. He also found love again, marrying American divorcee Kyle Jorgensen in May of 1997 and having 5 more children with her. So that's in addition to the 4 that he had with Lesley, so that's 9 kids. And so the years tick by with not a single suspicion raised, and it is clear that Colin has gotten away with cold-blooded murder. However, to paraphrase the late great Rick James, guilt is a hell of a drug, and a stunning series of events would trigger Colin's downfall. First, Colin tragically lost his older son Matthew, the son Lesley called out for in her final moments, in 2007 at the age of 22 following a freak accident in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he lost his grip on a staircase and fell 4 floors to the concrete below. Then Colin got tangled up in some get-rich-quick scheme where if he invested £350,000 to find some gold in the Philippines, he'd make $20 million, but then all he got were some brass ammunition boxes worth about £30, and I don't know, it sounds just one step moved from some Nigerian princes asking for your bank account numbers, but the net result was that after saving his practice with the wealth he gained from Lesley's death and then prospering, Colin is in debt once again. Losing his money and his son convinced Colin that God was punishing him for murdering Lesley and Trevor, which is why he decided it was time to come clean. And so, in early 2009, Colin confesses to his wife Kyle and the elders of his church, who have assembled at his house at Kyle's request, that, for starters, he had multiple affairs during their marriage. He admitted he had lost a substantial amount of money and was swimming in debt. He admitted that between 1998 and 2008, he had molested his dental patients while they were sedated, claiming that he was weak against his overwhelming sexual urges. And then, after skating away with murder for nearly 20 years, he confessed, finally, to killing Lesley and Trevor. Oh, but wait, there's more. There's always more, right? According to the Sunday Mirror, Kyle says that in addition to the cheating, lying, and murdering, Colin had a raging porn addiction. And she had actually known for about a decade that Colin had murdered Lesley and Trevor. She says that he blackmailed her into keeping quiet to protect their kids, claiming that unless she played ball, he would commit suicide, which this is a classic manipulation tactic to say that. But as she eventually had to admit to herself, Colin had indeed done a masterful job of manipulating her throughout their marriage, telling the Sunday Mirror about her husband, quote, "I'm having trouble really seeing one person I've known for 12 years as a good father and loving husband, but really it's like seeing a completely different person in the same skin. He abused patients. He is a compulsive liar. He was an adulterer in our marriage and murdered 2 people. Everyone thought he was this great Christian guy, but they were so wrong. He was a monster." The church elders tell Colin he needs to confess his crimes to the police, and he agrees. They call police to the house, and Colin is taken to the Coleraine police station on January 30th, 2009, where he finally cracks himself open. Now, a logical question throughout all of this is, what about Hazel? Indeed. It stands to reason that if Kyle knew that Colin had murdered Trevor and Lesley, that Hazel must have known too, right? Well, not only did she know about the murders, she was Colin's accomplice. As he rightly pointed out much later, this relationship was doomed from the start. He would testify, quote, "We were trying to make something work which had begun with adultery, then murder. We were trying to make something work that was rotten to the core." Tell it like it is. Colin, after the murders and everything kind of simmered down, he proposed to Hazel, even suggesting they pull up stakes and move to Scotland for a fresh start. But Hazel turned him down on both counts. Colin said that was when things began to take a bad turn between the two, saying, quote, "It changed after that. It became dark and difficult and challenging. I was relieved when she said no. It was a codependency linked by a dark secret. I proposed almost out of duty. I had killed her husband and left her 2 children fatherless. I didn't feel I could end the relationship." So the relationship, such as it was, dragged on for about another year after the proposal, with Colin further testifying that it finally all ended when Hazel cheated on him, because of course she did, of course. And because you can't make this stuff up, it was with a guy she dated before she married Trevor. And his name was Trevor. Yes. She cheated on Colin with a man named Trevor, which just happened to be the name of her dead husband, not ex-husband. Trevor McCauley, by the way, that was this particular gentleman's name. Her husband's name, Trevor Buchanan. And even more ironically, she would cheat on Trevor McCauley as well. This time with former chief superintendent with the RUC, David Stewart, having met him at the gym that Trevor McCauley paid the membership for. Oh my gosh, it's like a movie. It's like a novel. You can't make it up. Hazel and David got married in the summer of 2005. Colin would testify, quote, "I realized I was being two-timed. I was thinking to myself, I have been such a fool. I was angry with myself. I felt so humiliated." He went on to say that Hazel actually called him, quote, in her soft, silky voice, to apologize. And Colin says that in his mind, by that point, the relationship was dead and done. With her marriage to David Stewart, Hazel finally achieves the long-held dreams that were first hatched on the dairy farm where she grew up all those years ago. She and her husband had built a beautiful home from the ground up on Ballystrone Road in Coleraine, and it was considered a picturesque and highly desirable area. And as The Guardian noted, with her marriage to David, Hazel ascended the ranks to become, quote, a glamorous regular on the well-heeled social scene of the policing community along Northern Ireland's northern coast. Often pictured in the local press at charity dinners in figure-hugging ball gowns and flashing a porcelain-white smile. Well, that all comes crashing down because when Colin confessed to murdering his wife and Hazel's husband, he points the finger at Hazel. He's like, if I'm going down, you're coming with me. Going down together. As reported in the Belfast Telegraph, Colin told police that on May 14, 1991, which is 4 days before the murders, he and Hazel met up and he told her his ingenious plan to take out their spouses that would leave them free to be together. He testified that Hazel's initial reaction was, quote, we'll be caught. She was afraid of being caught. She said if she was caught, she would slit her wrists. And then in the justification so many murderers give for killing their spouses, Colin testified that he thought Hazel probably believed he had a plan for them to run away from it all, but he claims he just couldn't do that, saying, quote, I wouldn't have left Lesley because of the children. So, murder their mother instead. I mean, honestly, divorce is a thing. Truly. He claims he told Hazel it would look like a suicide, and for her part, she was to make sure that Trevor was sufficiently incapacitated because he was a police officer after all, and he had a firearm. And Colin, he didn't want to deal with that, of course. And so she needed to make sure also that he could get in and out of her garage easily, and that she was to cover for him when it was all over. Colin testified that he gave her some temazepam, which is a tranquilizer, and instructed her to crush up the pills and put them in Trevor's food, and that in his mind, the moment she took those pills from him, it was with the tacit understanding that they were in this together, saying, quote, she took the tablets and put them in her handbag. When I gave her the tablets, she understood the full plan. I felt it was the moment when the plan was agreed upon. So after Colin had murdered Lesley, he had called Hazel at 1 a.m. and hung up and waited for her to call him back. And when she did, he said, quote, I'm finished with Lesley. Is everything ready? That's chilling, actually. And indeed, things were ready. Because Hazel did as she was told, crushing up the pills and putting them in her husband's tuna sandwich. She opened up the garage, moved Trevor's white Toyota Corolla to make room for Colin's car when he arrived, and laid out the clothes for Trevor that Colin would put on Trevor when the time came, directed Colin to the bedroom where Trevor was sleeping, and watched as her lover murdered her husband, all while her 2 children were asleep down the hall. Afterward, Colin handed her the baby bottle and hose pipe, instructing her to cut them up and burn them. Open the bedroom window, clean up, and wait. When Colin arrived home 4 hours later, he called Hazel to let her know it had all gone off without a hitch. After Colin's confession to police about the murders and Hazel's part in them, police headed out to Ballystrone Road to arrest her, though they had to wait 45 minutes for her to come home from her dental appointment. So, sorry. Yes, she was getting, I guess, her teeth cleaned. I don't know. But they had to wait for her to be done with that before they could arrest her. Somewhat echoing what Colin's wife Kyle had said about the power that he had over her, Hazel claimed in her police interviews, quote, he was very controlling. Maybe I was easy prey, and that's how I look back on it and see that. He decided and he planned this. I hated him. He was capable of doing everything. I was scared for my children. I don't know if it was love or fear. He had control over me. It was like I was his little robot. She went on to say, quote, he's a very calculating person, a very clever guy. I'm not very bright, unfortunately, but he was a step ahead of me the whole time. I was scared. I thought if I say something against this, he'll kill me. And Colin himself admits he always wanted things how he wanted them, telling police he was a control freak who expected to get his way on all occasions, and for the women of his life to do just what he said. And when a detective asked him about the consequences of losing control in a relationship, he simply said, quote, the relationship ended. On February 3rd, 2009, Colin was charged with 2 counts of murder, and in December of that year, he received a sentence of 21 years to life, serving his sentence at HM Prison Mowbray, a high-security prison in County Antrim, where he is said to be a model prisoner. He was granted temporary release to attend his father's funeral in 2008. The only one of Colin's 8 living children to maintain any kind of relationship with him is his daughter Lauren, who visits him regularly in prison. Colin's now ex-wife Kyle took their 5 kids and fled back to America, eventually settling down in Florida to raise their children. Despite not coming forward sooner about what she knew regarding Colin murdering Lesley and Trevor, Kyle was never charged with anything. According to Belfast Live, an acquaintance of Colin's claims that Colin's, quote, only regret is that Kyle has not supported him after encouraging him to confess. He firmly believed she would stand by him. In 2011, Colin admitted to 9 counts of sexual assault on 4 of his patients, and he also confessed to assaulting a 5th patient. There's a separate time that he confessed to that. And as a result, he received a sentence of 5.5 years. Apparently, Colin has no problem being known as a murderer in prison, but takes great exception to being called a pervert, though I'm not sure what else you'd call it when you're molesting people who you've drugged, they're passed out. But according to an interview that a former fellow prisoner gave to the Sunday World about Colin, quote, he's an intelligent man and he can talk for hours. He was nice to me when I was in there, and he does that to everyone. He really tried to take me under his wing. That same prisoner went on to say that in particular, Colin yearns for contact from the outside, saying, quote, he's kept writing to me since I've left, asking about if I'm still playing football. He also wants me to keep writing him and wants me to go back and visit him. I don't want to go near him. Ouch. For her role, Hazel was also charged with 2 counts of murder, though her defense continued to be that she was an unwilling accomplice. She was sentenced to 18 years to life and is serving her sentence in Hyde Bank Women's Prison in South Belfast. Hazel's family has stuck by her throughout the entire saga, with she and her husband David talking up to 5 times a day and seeing each other once a week. This whole crazy, bananas, bonkers story was the subject of a blockbuster 4-episode miniseries in the UK called The Secret, based on Derek Henderson's book, Let This Be Our Secret. Colin's daughter criticized it as exploitative, and Hazel's husband, David, says her children weren't given the opportunity to preview the show before it aired. To Valerie Allen, Lesley's girlfriend from her school days, she believes this entire tragedy could have been averted had Lesley and Colin had more relationship experience. It was both kind of like their first serious relationship back when they first met, way back when. Valerie would also point to the couple's stringent religious principles as having a negative effect on them. Feeling the weight of these deep religious convictions might have forced them into something they weren't ready for. As she says in Let This Be Our Secret, quote, I felt that all of this had happened in a cultural structure where guilt about premarital sex and so on drove people together where they were under huge pressure to make the marriage work and not to divorce at any cost. I felt angry that they had not had enough life and sexual experience to have been able to handle this better. I'm guessing Lesley was the first one Colin had been with. I don't know if he was for her or not, but if they had both had a bit more sexual experience, they might not have gotten married, or they might have gotten married and made it work rather than be gobsmacked at an affair. I felt a lot of it was guilt and inexperience. It made them feel that they had to stay together when they had other options to them, like divorce or having sex with each other and not marrying. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes, and you can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.